Morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dee Wilson. Anyone of you that have been through our core training or recently knows how much I quote from Dee Wilson throughout that training. So here he is, I would say in the flesh, but I don't know, in the
Alas.
through the computer. But if you would please put your name or just in the chat, if you could just put it in where you're zooming in from. Dee had asked that we do that just so he can get a sense of where everybody's from. But other than that, Dee, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, probably some of you have been in other trainings that I've done, but just real briefly about my background. I worked 26 years in Washington State's child welfare system from 1978 to 2004. 17 years of that I spent in Spokane, and I was over there. I was a CPS social worker, and then I was a supervisor, and then I was a building manager when there were two of those people over there, other than whatever there are now, six or seven. And then in 1995, I came over to the West Side and ran the training center for a couple of years in West Seattle. And then I became a regional administrator in Region 6 for 7 years before I left the agency. I left the agency in 2004. I went to the University of Washington School of Social Work, where I ran a training and research institute there and taught in the MSW program for 5 years. And then I went to Casey Family Program in Seattle in the headquarters office there in North Seattle for about 6 years, and worked in a section called Knowledge Management, and retired from there in 2016. And since then, I've done training in this state mostly on various child welfare subjects. And this is one of them. I mean, neglect, this is one of the trainings, like we're going to do half a day here. I do training by contract for child welfare staff in this state on this subject in full day trainings. And I've done this in Oregon and in quite a few other states in the country as well. So this is one of the training. I also do training on critical thinking. I do training on dealing with secondary trauma and burnout, and in past years on reunification and on other subjects as well. So anyway, that's a little bit of the background here. Now, those of you, I have not been in a actual classroom since the pandemic started, as hard as that is to believe. And of course, this Zoom format leaves much to be desired there in terms of the ability to have a back and forth here. Nevertheless, I mean, we'll still hopefully provide some opportunities there. You can put questions or comments in chat box, or you can just interrupt, so and then every 15 minutes or so, I'll stop this and for questions. And then we'll take a break at about, probably an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, something like that. And then we'll come back and talk about another facet of this subject. And of course, this is a big subject with lots of dimensions there. And so maybe a little bit to say about neglect to start off with is that it's always been the most common form of maltreatment in the United States, far and away. So, and that has only gotten more so in recent years. So, somewhere between 75 to 80% of child victims in NCANS is the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System. That's the database that the feds use, and that they put out child maltreatment reports every year called child maltreatment. The most recent one was 2021 or 2020, I think. The new one is about to come out. And in those reports, about 75 to 80% of child victims, and that is, there have been substantiated then investigations within cases, or are kids who have been neglected. Maybe 20%, maybe a fourth of that number have been physically abused. Less than 1 in 10 children reported to CPS has been sexually abused, at least according to these numbers. So they're a very, very large, and the numbers, by the way, they add up to more than 100%, because kids can be maltreated in multiple ways, and they often are. As amazing as it sounds, if you go look at some of the NCANS numbers in some states, not every state, but in some states, 100% of children have been neglected in terms of substantiations, 100%. And that seems like it just could not be true. And yet it is in terms of the NCAN's numbers there. So neglect has always been the most common. Well, why? Why? Because, by the way, this is not the case in Western Europe. And it's not as much the case in Canada or England or Australia. I mean, there still is lots of neglect in those other English-speaking countries, but particularly in the European countries, in Northern Europe, Germany, and so forth, most maltreatment is physical abuse or sexual. So this is something that is really very, very characteristic of countries that historically have had high child poverty rates, which until recently this country has. Now, amazing as it sounds, maybe some of you have read news stories or reports that within the last year or two, the child poverty rate here in this country dropped to below 10%. I mean, maybe even in the 6 or 7% area, which is the lowest it's ever been. For most of the last 2 or 3 decades, the child poverty rate has been close to 20%, compared to Western Europe rates of probably 5 or 6%. I mean, just much, much higher child poverty rates. And so the argument that I guess the perspective that I'm offering is that high rates of neglect within a child welfare system is indicative of countries that have high child poverty rates, because there is such a enmeshment, such a strong association between neglect and poverty. That's not all that's involved, obviously, in neglect, as we'll talk about as we go through the morning here, but it's the main underlying factor. It's sort of the context of what happens in child neglect here. So let me ask for a second here. So we're going to talk about someone asking you to find neglect. So that's what we're going to do now. So what I want you to do is to think about in your community, the basic needs of kids, which if they were not met on a consistent basis, might, in your opinion, lead to a CPS report, which the public agency would actually screen in. Maybe you know that this state's child welfare agency screens out about 60% of reports. But of the reports that are screened in, so again, and if you don't have intimate knowledge of how child welfare operates in your community, you can translate this into kind of an ought question. I mean, what are the basic needs of kids which you believe ought to lead to a CPS report that would then be screened in? So let's talk about some of those basic needs of kids. What would those be? And you can either put this in chat or you can speak up.
Basic needs would be housing, food.
Okay, so let's talk. We'll come back to the housing. I'm going to put that aside for a second because this is an area where Washington State has very unusual kind of a definition. Maybe it might be even a unique kind of way of dealing with the issue of housing and homelessness. So I'm going to come back to that. But toddler wandering outside, so lack of supervision in some states, that is probably as much as half of all neglect reports or lack of supervision. So that's really a very, very common one. Safe home, decent nutrition. Yeah, safety in the home. Lots of issues are in neglect, particularly in chronic neglect, about the hygiene of homes. I mean, in some homes, incredibly filthy kind of conditions. Kids being fed regularly. Yeah, we kind of expect in this country that kids are going to be fed regularly. Now, I do want to say that, maybe I'll come back and talk about this a little bit more later, is that if parents are systematically depriving kids of food, that is not as a result of poverty, but for example, as a form of child discipline or something like that, that's not neglect, that's abuse. And in fact, in its extreme forms, it's actually torture. So Sandy says shelter, food, access to education. So now this is getting to the list. This list that Sandy has listed here in the chat is very much like the list that is included in many state, probably most state statutes around the country. So all states have laws that define child maltreatment, neglect, so they're neglect statutes. And most of those states include a short list, kind of like you might say a handful of the basic needs of kids. And so Sandy's list gets pretty close to it. Food, shelter, that's true in most states, but not, as I'm going to come back to, in Washington. Access to education, That's not on most lists, but it is on many. Supervision, that's pretty much on all lists. What else? What else in terms of the basic needs of kids? We've listed some of them, but not maybe all of them. Mary says parents taken into custody by police. Yeah, that's not actually listed a lot of times as neglect a lot of times, but that's the reason that kids are clothes. Yeah, clothing. That's one of those basic needs that most states list. Safe home, shelter. Let me see what else. Clothes that fit. Lack of working utilities. No, yes, that would be true. No water, electric, sort of medical and emotional neglect. So medical neglect and dental neglect are included just about in every state on these short lists. And most states do have definitions of emotional neglect in their statutes, though interestingly, Washington state doesn't. So the Washington state definition of neglect is different than lots of other state statutes in that it's more of a conceptual definition. That is, it talks about negligent treatment and maltreatment of children. That's the conceptual without listing things like shelter, food, access to education, supervision, without listing those concrete kind of needs. It defines neglect in kind of a conceptual way. And that's what I call a fill in the blanks kind of definition. So it turns out that negligent treatment and maltreatment is what public agencies, mandated reporters, and courts say it is at a particular point in time. So that's why I say it's a fill in the blanks definition. It's very subject to changes in social attitudes and in social beliefs and in practices of agencies, right? So most states define neglect kind of concretely in the way that I've mentioned. There's a minority of states, Washington is one of them, that uses a more conceptual kind of definition. In practice, for the most part, it probably doesn't matter a lot whether the definition is concrete or abstract, except in regard to the exceptions. And this is where state statutes then begin to differ greatly. So for example, in Washington state, access to education, educational neglect, that is not in itself grounds for a CPS investigation. In most states, it is. In Washington state, for example, if someone makes a report that's saying that parents of a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old child aren't sending the child to school, in and of itself, that is not going to cause a CPS investigation. In New York state, it is. In most states, it is. And so in states that include educational neglect, CPS caseworkers go out on thousands of those reports a year, but not in Washington. In Washington, educational neglect has to be combined with allegations of other kinds of neglect to generate a CPS response. Now, that doesn't mean that Washington state is not interested in educational neglect or something. It just means that it has a different way of handling it outside the child welfare system, outside the child protection system. Washington state has maybe the only statute in the country that explicitly says that homelessness in and of itself is not grounds for a CPS report or for a CPS investigation. Okay, in most states in the country, it is grounds. So this is a way that Washington state statute is very, very different. So, and why is our statute that way? Because in the late 1990s, early 2000s, homelessness advocates in this state were able, there was a settlement of a class action lawsuit around the issue of neglect and homelessness so there was an agreement that there would be inclusion in state statute of a statement to the effect that homelessness in and of itself. Now, usually, of course, homelessness is combined with other things. I mean, it is combined with other types of neglect, not to mention drug and alcohol issues and chronic mental illness and stuff like that. But in and of itself, homelessness is not grounds for a CPS investigation. Many states, probably about half the states, including Washington, also have a poverty exception. And so what the poverty exception says is that poverty, if parents are unable to meet the basic needs of kids, that list that we've already talked about, due to poverty, that in and of itself is not grounds for a finding of neglect. So in other words, it says that if you can't provide shelter or food or something like that because you're poor, that doesn't mean that you're a neglectful parent. So that's what the poverty exception means. Now, half the states in this country do not have a poverty exception. And so in those states, yes, parents can be found neglectful just because they can't afford to provide the basic needs of kids. And so this issue around the intersection, the enmeshment of neglect and poverty, this is a very large issue, and we're going to come back to that. Washington State is one of the few, maybe only 2 or 3 state statutes in the entire country that does not have a definition of emotional abuse and neglect. Nothing concrete to say on the subject, other than what might be implied by the term negligent treatment and maltreatment, which is a very broad kind of way of defining neglect, right? But most states define emotional neglect in some more specific kind of way, which Washington does not. And so in past year, you know, when I came back and began to do training in the state in 2016 on neglect, and I sat down with people from the training center, I discovered that they were telling people, new caseworkers in Washington State, that this state does not recognize emotional abuse and neglect. Well, that's a particular kind of, in my view, odd way of interpreting the statute, but that's what caseworkers in this state were actually being trained to. That there was, from the standpoint of the child protection system, no such thing as emotional abuse and neglect. Well, that's extremely weird, to say the least, but that's what the training was at that point in time. Let me see, what else? Some states, there's probably half a dozen states in the country, most in the South and Southwest, that that say something in their statutes about the need of parents to socialize their children to basic moral beliefs and behaviors, like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not destroy other people's property, blah, blah, you know, stuff like that. That's not widespread, but it's still there. There probably is a dozen states in the country that define exposure of children in utero, that is to a fetus in utero, to dangerous or illegal substances. That would be defined as neglect in some states, but not in this state and not in most other states. So I guess is what I'm saying is there are a lot of similarities in these statutes, particularly in the identification of the basic needs of kids, but also some very marked differences. And as a result of that, it's always a little questionable to start comparing statistics in various states around the percentage of neglect cases or the numbers of neglected kids or blah, 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 because these aren't apples to apples type of definitions. States are defining these things in different kind of ways. So for example, one other way that our state is different. We have something in statute that says that domestic violence witnessing, that is children who witness parents and even a pattern of domestic violence witnessing, is in and of itself not grounds for a CPS investigation. We are one of the few states in the country that has anything like that. Now, if you were a CPS caseworker in Utah, you're going out on DV stuff a lot, and in quite a few other places as well, right? But not here. Now, again, DV a lot of times is combined with lots of other things that are viewed as neglectful that would cause an investigation, right? And that would be, as we'll come back to here in a minute, that would be quite common here. But DV in and of itself is not grounds for a CPS investigation, even if children are witnessing it on a regular basis in this state. And that is, again, because of the influence of advocates. So advocates, DV advocates in this case, have had a tremendous influence on state law in the state by going directly to legislators and pleading their case around the idea that CPS interventions do more harm than good, and that this particular group of people should not be investigated for whatever the concern is. So parents missing or die, abandonment, that is a part of neglect in pretty much every state. And sometimes in federal statute, that is, I mean, that is sometimes even listed as kind of separate from neglect. But, you know, to me, it's kind of a part of neglect. I mean, kids are abandoned. Does homeless mean only no permanent address in Washington state? No, I don't think it is anything as concrete as that. I just think it means that children and parents just do not have shelter. Or they don't have permanent shelter of their own. They might have shelter in a shelter care facility, something like that. And of course, you kind of know that among homelessness advocates, I mean, there's a very large distinction between homeless people who have some kind of shelter. I mean, they may be doubled up with friends, or they may be living in, you know, some weird kind of place that shelters them, but they don't have their own apartment, or they don't have their own housing, versus those who are living, quote, rough on the street. You know, that's a kind of a little bit of a different, more extreme form of homelessness, and it's probably what is behind lots of the controversy around homelessness policies in this state and in this country. Where can we find the Washington definition and exceptions? There is a, you know, I'll find the RCW numbers. I'll send them to you. Can find this easily though. I mean, these are online and accessible, so they're going to be a part of the RCWs, and I'll find the specific numbers for you, and I'll send it to Ryan after this training is over. Will you discuss how these criteria apply when it comes to return of children to the parent? Yes. Yeah. So this is a little down the road here, but yes, I will come back to that. So, so let me stop here before I leave the subject of the definitions and see if you have comments or questions. So maybe one of the things that's obvious already from the discussion is that that neglect is very much of an umbrella kind of a term. I mean, it refers to lots of different things and to a number of different dimensions of child care. So in a way, you can think about the sort of dimensions of neglect. I mean, there's issues around feeding, there's issues around hygiene, supervision, medical care and neglect, education. We haven't mentioned the issue of nurturance. And that is very much a part of chronic neglect. And of course, it would be defined in some state statutes as emotional neglect. That's very much a part of the neglect picture, particularly for kids in foster care. So yeah, so a very broad kind of a definition. And occasionally I've had some people in audiences sometimes say, well, it wouldn't be so surprising that there would be huge numbers of neglect cases, given the fact that the neglect term is so broad that it applies to so many things. And of course, it's so very, very changeable. That is, it depends on the social environment at a particular time. So just one more comment about the definitions. So I grew up in Texas in the 1950s. In that era, at that time, it was very common for adults of all social classes to drive kids around in the back of pickup trucks at high speeds, on country roads, on freeways, and on city streets, wherever. And that wasn't viewed as child endangerment. That wasn't viewed as, quote, neglect. And a lot of people did it. And I was on the back of those pickup trucks many, many times. Today, if that was true and a kid was, and many, of course, kids have been killed as a result of that practice, many kids. That's why it's, you know, that's why it stopped. If that were to happen today, that would be a criminal charge. You know, when I worked in Colorado's child welfare system in the 1970s, when we didn't necessarily even have to use seat belts for kids, much less car seats. If that were to happen today, a caseworker would be fired, and there would possibly be charges of criminal negligence brought if a child was hurt as a result of that, right? So this is what I mean by to say that neglect is a socially defined thing at a specific point in time. It's not like the measles. It's not like having some disease that, you know, you kind of understand what that is. Measles in 1920 is measles in 2020. But neglect in 1920 is not neglect in 2020. There's that very much depends not just on neglect laws and statutes, it also depends on social beliefs and attitudes. So let me get one more pause here for a comment or question on the subject of definitions before we go on to another subject here. Okay. And by the way, on the subject of definitions, one more thing to say. I have written a sounding board commentary on this subject, which is about 2,300 words or something, that I will send to Ryan. And anyway, summarizes some of what I've already said here, and I'll send it to him. Okay, so one of the ways to think about neglect I've already said there's a lot of it, but it's not a homogeneous phenomenon, and so I kind of want to, so I'm going to give you kind of a typology that I think is useful in an operational way. It's not an academic typology exactly. So I think, which means that it's useful to caseworkers, it's useful within agencies. So a lot of neglect, arguably about a third of cases that are reported and screened in CPS agencies are what I call situational neglect. So the families have one or two reports. The reports don't necessarily mention drug and alcohol issues or chronic mental illness, DV, anything like that. Sometimes the people are reported for an incident of neglect. Sometimes it's a serious incident. Sometimes it isn't. There's a brief intervention. Sometimes parents are given a service. A lot of times they aren't. Sometimes they're given information. Occasionally they're given a warning. The case is closed out and the family never comes back. And that is that's a large group of people, fortunately for child welfare agencies. And then there is another third of people that I refer to as sporadically neglectful, intermittently neglectful. And so in these families, the neglect tends to be more serious, but even more to the point, there start to be more reports about it. So maybe 3, 4, 5 reports within a couple of years, or within two or 3 years. Those reports do often mention drug and alcohol issues or chronic mental illness or DV, but the main thing that characterizes these families is that sometimes the parenting is pretty good, at least it's marginally good, sometimes it's better than marginally good, and sometimes it isn't. So if parents are neglectful, they're not neglectful all the time. These are families that have strengths, and they particularly have the ability to nurture kids, not just to take care of their physical needs, but to nurture kids. But then they have one or more chronically relapsing conditions, drug and alcohol, chronic mental illness, DV, to mention the most obvious ones. And so at the time of relapse, or at the time of another occurrence of major depressive disorder or something like that, kids then are neglected. There's a CPS report, and CPS agencies work with families then to restore their optimal level of functioning. And there really is an optimal level of functioning, because a lot of times the families are doing a pretty good job of taking care of the kids a lot of the time. And then there is the chronic neglect group, which we're going to talk about here at length here some. And this is where I've done most of the training over the last 20 years or so. So in these cases, there might be half a dozen or more CPS reports over a period of a few years. Sometimes there are shocking numbers of reports. Now, when I have caseworkers in a group like this, I usually ask them, what's the most CPS reports you ever saw in a family in your office? And a lot of times these will be new caseworkers that maybe have just been there a year, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes veterans. I've never heard an answer that's less than 30, 40, 50, 60. One time in Seattle, families that had over 100 reports over 15 years. Shocking numbers of reports. So these are outlier cases. These aren't averages or anything like that, but they do suggest kind of something about a level of tolerance for chronic neglect. And if you get families that have 30, 40, 50 reports, the great majority of those reports, probably 3/4 of the reports or more, are going to be in the neglect category. But here is one important thing, one sort of idea that I want to communicate in this training. The more reports there are in a family, the more likely it is that there is a combination of neglect with physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. So I want to say that again. The more reports there are in a family, the more likely children are being maltreated in multiple ways, not just neglected, physically abused, and sexually abused. So I call this type of maltreatment chronic maltreatment. So the combination of neglect with physical abuse or sexual abuse and emotional abuse is always a part of that. And this is the most difficult therapeutic challenge that child welfare agencies face. So I will say this again, this is the toughest kind of child protection issue that there is, not only in this state, but around the country. And one that by and large, child welfare agencies are not dealing with all that well or effectively, which we'll come back to this. So what is it that characterizes chronic neglect? So first is that the neglect is very pervasive. So I mentioned before that, think of all the different kind of dimensions of neglect, or the categories. So think about food, clothing, shelter, hygiene, medical and dental care, supervision, nurturance, education, all this stuff. In chronic neglect, it's all of the above. You know, when you deal with sporadic neglect and situational neglect, a lot of times when you have reported incidents, you're talking about a very specific type of neglect. Lots of times it's lack of supervision. You get lots of reports of lack of supervision, and that's the only kind of neglect that's being alleged in that family. But when you talk about chronic neglect, it's multiple types of neglect. So now any one report might just mention one thing. It might mention lack of supervision. It might need lack of dependable feeding. It might be the inability or refusal of parents to do something about their children having lice in the hair, or not having a code at school or something like that. But if you look at a pattern of reports, if you look at several reports over time, it's going to be a scatter of those kind of concerns. And so it's not so much important in those cases what the allegations are in the most recent report. It's what's going on in the pattern of reports in which kids are being neglected in multiple kind of ways there, right? So it might be fair to say in those cases that many of those kids are living in a condition. They're just not being neglected at a specific point in time. They're living in a certain kind of condition that's characterized by pervasive neglect across many childcare domains, including the lack of nurturance. And then some of those chronic neglect cases then become chronic maltreatment cases, the ones that I mentioned before. So neglect then evolves into a combination of neglect and physical abuse and or sexual abuse and emotional abuse as well, right? So this is partly a typology and hopefully operationally useful typology that I have trained to with caseworkers in this state for a lot of years. So the idea is that competent child protection programs would not be dealing with chronic neglect in the same way you deal or they deal with situational neglect or sporadic neglect. Those are different kind of phenomena. So I'm going to say that again. Once families become chronic, once neglect is chronic in families, then child welfare agencies need to change their practices. And we're going to talk about how those practices need to change. But one of the main ones I've already mentioned. Instead of focusing on the most recent alleged incident, they need to focus on the pattern of incidents, the pattern of neglect over time in various reports. So instead of an incident focus, they need to move to a pattern focus. And that would be one of the differences in terms of assessment issues. So it turns out that cases that are screened in, investigated for neglect kind of divide kind of roughly into these 3 or 4 categories in terms of a third. About a third of families are situational, about a third of families are sporadic or intermittent, about a third of the families are chronic or chronic maltreatment. And the one other thing to understand there is that once neglect has become chronic, there is a real super high risk that it's going to evolve into chronic maltreatment. So this is not only just a way of categorizing some reports at intake, this is also a dynamic in which situational neglect gradually becomes sporadic neglect. Sporadic neglect gradually becomes chronic neglect. And chronic neglect ultimately becomes chronic maltreatment. So one of the goals then of hopefully child welfare interventions, but also prevention programs in communities and so forth, is to stop that progression, is to stop the progression from situational neglect to sporadic neglect to chronic maltreatment. And the key to doing that is early intervention. So it's not, as the ad says, it's not atomic physics. You want to stop chronic neglect from evolving, you have to do something early on before it's already embedded in the way that families raise kids. Now, one other thing to mention about these patterns here. So, and by the way, there has been some, excellent research, the best in the world on chronic neglect done in this country by a handful of scholars over the years. And so one of those scholars is Melissa Johnson Reed at Washington University. Her husband is Brett Drake. And so one of the things that they've discovered in looking at cases in Missouri and that area of the country is that in a lot of the chronic neglect cases, the first couple of reports tend to be for neglect only kind of things. That is, there'll be a couple of types of neglect mentioned, but there won't be any reports of physical abuse, any alleged physical abuse or sexual abuse in the first couple of reports. By the time you get to the third or fourth report, there start to be mentions, allegations of either physical abuse or sexual abuse in those families. So you have a pattern there, so there's a dynamic. Situational neglect is evolving into sporadic neglect. Sporadic neglect is evolving into chronic neglect, really. So how is that happening exactly? So anyway, so I'm going to talk about a dynamic here. So first, let me ask a question here. So Janet says, do those go under the FAR cases? So yeah, a lot of cases in all of these three categories go into FAR, but hopefully just about all of the situational neglect and a lot of the sporadic neglect would go into FAR. I don't really know whether DCYF has policies around sending chronic neglect cases to FAR. I hope they're not doing that, but I can't speak for them. If they are doing it, it's a misunderstanding. So let me stop before I talk about the dynamic here and see if you have any comments or questions about the typology. So what I've offered you is a typology. And a typology is just a way of categorizing sort of a large phenomena, right? Breaking it into parts kind of thing. And the reason I like this particular typology is because it has operational uses. It's not an academic, it's not a scholar's typology, it's a practitioner's typology. It means that once you know which case a family fits in, then that tells you something about what you ought to be doing there in terms of changing your practice there. Right? So let me stop. And again, before I go on, let me give you a chance for a comment or a question here. Alicia says, I'm a former family assessment response worker, and at that time we got all the chronic neglect cases. Well, the problem with doing that is that in the FAR program in this state and in most of the differential response, FAR is the language used in this state to refer to what nationally is referred to as differential response, right? So that is interacting with parents in a way where you're not investigating. You're basically offering them a service and not being as intrusive in terms of investigative practices. The problem with FAR rules and differential response rules is they're very time limited rules. So the idea in past years in this state has been that there would be a 90-day time limit on services, and maybe that could be extended once to 6 months. Most of the chronic neglect cases cannot be handled in this brief kind of way. So that is just a complete misunderstanding. And also the kind of services that FAR has at their disposal are not the kind of services that these families need. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. So, you don't use skill-based, if you know anything about what you're doing, you don't use skill-based services with chronic neglect. You use skill-based services, these evidence-based programs, with situational neglect or with sporadic neglect as a way of keeping it from becoming chronic neglect, right? So that's the problem. That's the issue with the FAR fund. They screened in lower on the metric the state used to assess cases. Yeah, that's true, because again, why is that so? Because the state is using this particular way of defining child safety as having kids being, quote, in danger. And a lot of chronically neglected kids, when they're reported to CPS, are not in danger. They nevertheless are being very, very affected by the conditions in which they're living. So again, this is a misunderstanding of child safety. It is one that this state has operated now for more than 10 years. And it's true a lot of places around the country as well. That's a very inadequate way of defining child safety to deal with chronic neglect cases. Due to not being able to fix the issues in the 60 to 90 days given, yeah, or even in a 6-month period of time. So a lot of the families would need at least a year of service. And truthfully, one of the things I'm going to say here in a few minutes is that for the families that have developmental delay, that is, the parents have IQs of maybe 80 or below, in addition to some of these other issues, some of those families need to be open until kids are in school. I mean, for years, if kids are going to remain in the family. So it's ludicrous to think that you're going to deal with a chronic neglect case in 90 days or something. I mean, that's just, maybe I shouldn't even say anymore, because I'll just say something that would not be helpful. But to put it mildly, that's a poorly informed way of dealing with chronic neglect. Okay, so what's the dynamic here? What's going on in the families where situational neglect becomes sporadic neglect becomes chronic neglect here? So one of the things to understand about, even once cases have got into the sporadic neglect area, the families are going to have underlying chronically relapsing conditions. And so chronic drug and alcohol, I mean, there's a wide acknowledgement or understanding that that's a chronically relapsing condition. But the same is true of the mood disorders. The same is true of anxiety, depression, PTSD. Those are chronically relapsing conditions just as much as drug and alcohol is. And for many of the families involved in family violence, not all of them, but for many of the families involved in family violence, that is very much of a recurrent phenomenon that has a sort of a cyclical kind of a area here, right? Nature here, right? So, so one of the ways that chronic neglect differs than a lot of times from situational neglect is that the parents have these underlying conditions that really do have to be addressed here. Now over the years, I've occasionally gone to other states that have used practice models, kind of, solution-based practice models that that operate under the idea that we don't really necessarily need to understand the causes of things. We just need to understand how to remedy them. That is, I don't really need to understand what's going on in chronic neglect if I can just give someone a service or a program and stop all the neglectful behavior. Why do I need to understand what's going on in chronic neglect? So that underlying kind of idea that we're going to look for solutions without understanding causes or dealing with causes, I think sometimes that's been effective in sort of the less serious kind of child maltreatment cases and in the prevention world, but in chronic neglect, it is hapless. So the families do have a lot of times drug and alcohol issues that have to be dealt with. They have chronic mental illness, and they have to, and a lot of times what makes it so hard, they have co-occurring versions of these disorders. That is, they have combinations many times of substance abuse and depression, substance abuse and PTSD. They may have multiple mood disorders, not just one. That is anxiety, depression, and PTSD, along with family violence, and not to mention the poverty thing. So a lot of times, also in the chronic neglect cases, the families are even poorer than the families in the situational or the sporadic neglect cases. So in other words, the families are not just poor, they're severely poor. So about 10, 12 years ago in this state, Partners for Our Children, a research entity at the University of Washington that I helped to develop when I was there, did a survey of 700 to 800 families in this state. This would have been about 2009, 700 to 800 families with open child welfare cases. And they had in-home cases and kids in foster care as well. Okay, those 700 or 800 families, about 50% of those families had incomes less than $10,000 a year. And even in 2010, that was severely poor. That's just not poor, that's severely poor. So that's on the verge of homelessness poor, or that's the kind of, those are people who are periodically homeless a lot of the time, right? And if incomes of $10,000 a year, more than one child in a family, you can rest assured that there's food insecurity in that family. That is, family members aren't necessarily eating 3 meals a day or even 2 meals a day a lot of the time in a reliable way that they can count on. So severe poverty, not just poverty, severe poverty in lots of those families, right? So it turns out that the neglect cases, more than in physical abuse and sexual abuse, they tend to be more recurrent. That is, it's more likely that neglect families reported initially for neglect are going to be re-reported at a later date, or there are going to be more than one founded in that family. That is, an investigation that ends up with a substantiation. There's going to be more than one of those. Or if kids have been removed from the family and then they've been reunited with parents, that kids would re-enter foster care. And lots of kids do in fact re-enter foster care. So by any sort of measure of reoccurrence, the neglecting families are more likely. And once you get into this chronic neglect thing, then they're more likely to be re-reported. So the simple common sense kind of way of understanding it is that every subsequent CPS report increases the possibility that there's going to be another CPS report. That's sort of the influence of history there, right? So the idea, for example, that any one sensible person in a child welfare agency or professional would need a risk assessment tool to figure out chronic neglect, just count the reports. You don't need any risk assessment tool to classify the family as high risk. Just look at the reports. You've already got 5 or 6 reports. You know there's going to be another report. Okay, Nancy says, isn't the cause of poverty the same as the cause of chronic neglect? Okay, this is one of the things, let's talk about this a little bit, because this is where the child welfare scholarship is not adequate. So think for a second about what's the relationship for a second between poverty, substance abuse, chronic mental illness, and DV. And so I want you to think about this for a second, because scholars have not provided a definitive answer to this. So this is the question of really of what's going on here. So what's causing what? I got another way to say this is what's causing what? Poverty, substance abuse, chronic mental illness, and DV. And that, by the way, that's only 4 of the things you find in chronic neglect. Now, I've already mentioned there may be 15% of the cases that parents have, they might have an IQ of 80 or below. That's 15% of the neglect cases, right? Yeah, I read a study within the last week that found that about a third of children in foster care have had either have or have had an incarcerated parent. So very, very high levels of involvement with the criminal justice system. And of course, I haven't even brought up the issue of physical illnesses of either the parents or the kids, and there are many of those. Okay, so let me go back here and I'm going to ask this again. What's the relationship causally between poverty, substance abuse, chronic mental illness, and DV? And I've already told you there's not a scholarly right answer to this, so we're in the sort of a speculative realm here. So, you know, mental emotional awareness, let me see, isn't the cause of need? You know, I'm not quite sure, Gabriel, what you're saying here. I mean, so you want to say any more about this mental emotional? I think you mean mental emotional awareness of parents and unmet needs. Am I right there?
Yeah, just general unmet needs, whether it's physical, emotional. I mean, poverty often, you know, leads to unmet physical needs. You know, basic shelter, stable homes, you know, nutrition, all the basic things, and then, you know, educational and just general awareness, you know, emotional awareness. Yeah, I feel like that's a relationship, you know, amongst all of those things.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of times, again, you have folks who have, and I think that's true. And so I think that what's happening here is that you have a set of chronically relapsing conditions that gradually, little by little, are taking away the sort of the agency of people.
Mm-hmm.
And the psychological, the poverty factors are doing that on the social side of things. That is, the poorer you are, the less control you have over where you can live, over your neighborhood where you can live, over life circumstances, over where you can work, over where you can travel. You know, that's the effect of poverty. But of course, addiction, you gradually lose control over your own behavior and over the ability to manage your own health issues and so forth, right? As Kathy says, could the stress of severe poverty lead to PTSD? That's my opinion. I mean, that's part of it. So I guess there's not one what I'm saying is there probably isn't one causal nexus here which applies to all cases, but this is certainly one of them. So ask yourself the question, what if you and your family were put out on the street tomorrow? What if you didn't have any place to live? And then take it a month or 2 or 3 down the line and ask about, well, what do you think your mental health would be like? So yeah, I mean, part of the issue around homelessness, of course, is that many people become homeless. This is the same kind of causal issues in the homelessness areas in child abuse and neglect. Sometimes people become homeless because they already have addiction problem. They already are chronically mentally ill, so they can't work on a regular basis, right? But at the same time, if you become homeless because you just cannot afford, you get evicted, you can't afford housing in your area, 2 or 3 months later, what do you think the rate of mental illness is going to be for people who entered homelessness in a pretty emotionally sound way? Homelessness in and of itself is going to lead to mental illness in lots of cases, and for understandable reasons. So it's kind of like, I guess what I'm saying is the causal thing can work both ways. That is, now in child welfare, a lot of times the underlying condition context is poverty. I mean, in the chronic neglect group, we're not dealing with lots of formerly middle-class people who were teachers, nurses, and everything, and then they ended up using methamphetamine, and then they lost their jobs, and blah, blah, blah. That's not, those aren't the life trajectories that by and large we encounter in child welfare. Is that by and large, the families were always poor. But that doesn't mean that they were always also mentally ill, or that they were also always drug and alcohol affected and so forth, right? That's something that evolves over time, right? Catherine, poverty, substance abuse, and mental illness are cyclical, yes. And can usually be traced historical, yes. So some families, for example, some people grew up being poor, and some people grew up in severe poverty. And so there is, for everything, for substance abuse, yeah, this is true for DV as well. There, for some people, there's kind of an intergenerational kind of cycle here, right? That's not true for everyone by any means, but it's true for a lot of people. People grew up poor and they're still poor because they were not able to use the educational system to climb out of poverty, to develop skills that would make them employable, would raise their income, and so forth. And Catherine says, usually there are structural factors like, yeah, racism. Yeah, race and poverty are very enmeshed in this country. I mean, completely. So, and by what do I mean as enmeshed? So I mentioned rates of severe poverty before, you know, incomes less than 50% of the federal poverty standard. So the federal poverty standard today for a family of maybe 3, I'm just guessing, it might be in the 24,000 area, 23, 24,000. So imagine for a second that you have an income that's half of that. Let's say you have an income now that's less than $11,000 or $12,000 and you live in Seattle. You're going to live in Seattle on an income of less than $12,000 a year? How exactly are you going to do that? Right? So, yeah. So you end up with sort of levels of severe poverty that are sort of passed on from generation to generation. Now, in terms of the racial thing, Black Americans and American Indians have rates of severe poverty. They're 3 or 4 times higher than whites. I want to say that again. Rates of severe poverty that are 3 or 4 times higher than whites, right? So in severe poverty, very, very associated with chronic neglect here, as I've already mentioned here, right? So you talk about, so one of the things that would be very helpful in terms of the scholarship here would come to a better understanding of these kind of these causal relationships. And again, it isn't going to be just one story for everybody. I mean, there is going to be, obviously, there's going to be some differences and some variations, but there is an underlying theme that applies to just about everyone that I've already mentioned here. And that underlying theme is disempowerment. So, and disempowerment means that over time you have less agency, you have less control over every facet of your life. By virtue of either you don't have the economic resources to do things or to be able to move out of intolerable conditions, but it also means that you can't control your own behavior. You can't control your mental emotional functioning. You can't control your emotional functioning. You can't control your reactivity, your emotional outburst. And it's that kind of disempowerment, by the way, that makes neglect so incredibly impactful on children, because these are the very issues that are being communicated to the next generation, and particularly the stress reactivity thing here that I just mentioned here. Okay, so the dynamic here that I want to mention then, to go back to this and talk about this a little bit longer here. So the first dynamic in chronic neglect and chronic maltreatment is the erosion and the collapse of social norms around parenting. So I'm going to say that again. The first dynamic is the erosion or the collapse of social norms around parenting. So what is a social norm around parenting? And you mentioned, some of you mentioned it in the chat column when we talked about the definitions of neglect. The idea that kids should be fed in a pretty consistent, regular way. You know, that's so taken for granted that we don't even really have to say it a lot of the time. That, for example, a parenting standard would be that preschool children, kids who are younger than 6, should be supervised at all times if they're not sleeping. And even when they're sleeping, there ought to be someone in the home. That's a parenting standard, right? It doesn't really even necessarily need to be written down in law. I mean, we live in a society and a culture that shares these kind of views and attitudes largely. You don't even really have to defend those things usually, right? And a lot of times people can operate by social norms when they can't even say what they are. They can't even articulate them. But you notice when they're not being abided by. So let me kind of give an example of how this might work in a chronic neglect case. So imagine that you're a young mom and that your income is low. I mean, you have a couple of kids, but you don't have a car. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment. So one afternoon, you put your kids down for a nap and you don't have a car. You walk to a food store about 20-25 minutes away to get something for dinner, and you walk home. You've been gone for 45 minutes while the kids have been in bed. That's a violation of a social norm around supervision, but it's not an egregious violation. Most of us could understand how that could happen. Imagine the same mom who's pretty socially isolated, puts her kids down to bed at 7:38 at night, and then goes out drinking with her girlfriends till 2 or 3 in the morning. Okay, that's an egregious violation of a social norm around parenting, right? About 15 years ago in Kent office had a case in which a mom was leaving her 20-month-old toddler in a playpen for 2 or 3 days at a time while she lived with her boyfriend, who didn't have any tolerance or interest in her child, right? So she would come back every 2 to 3 days and clean up the playpen. And you can imagine the sort of condition of the playpen. Well, that little boy, that 20-month-old didn't die, but he came very close to dying. So the idea here is that a mom doesn't go, a young mother who's impacted by perhaps depression, but also definitely by poverty, doesn't go from leaving her kids alone for 45 minutes to walk to the grocery store to leaving her kids alone to 2 to 3 days to be with her boyfriend. It doesn't happen like that. It's a gradual erosion of norms around supervision. And that's why there is the opportunity then for prevention, for early intervention kind of stuff. And this is where child welfare people really need to understand this. That's why early intervention is so important. You want to stop that erosion before it happens. I mean, and sometimes that's just giving people information. Sometimes it's telling them, sometimes it is giving people a warning. Sometimes it's giving them a brief service. And one of the things that has become noticeable in recent years is that the poverty-related services are, I mean, sometimes just money, has a tremendously positive therapeutic effect, even in small amounts, if it's given in a timely way. So it's turned out that in some of these sort of experiments within the last 4 to 5 years, even giving people a few $100s a month, even giving people $1,000 once can really have an effect on the number of neglect reports that are subsequently made on those individuals. And there is now some good experimental research to support that. So when you talk about poverty-related interventions, a lot of the time, I'm very surprised by this, that small amounts of money can make large amounts of differences if that economic intervention is delivered in a timely way. If you wait until neglect is chronic, however, it's not going to have much effect at all, because then at that point, the parenting practices are being affected by drug and alcohol, by chronic mental illness, by DV, and a lot of times by a lot of other factors as well there, right? So that's the sort of the idea, the collapse or the erosion of social norms around parenting. Now, in chronic maltreatment, as I've already mentioned, this can get to really be, once standards collapse, then almost anything is possible in those families, once that's happened. And it is almost really, truly shocking, the kind of things that do sometimes happen at the sort of the far end of this process. And I've mentioned the one about the mother leaving her kids alone with, you know, her toddler alone in a playpen, but other things. For example, the sexual exploitation of children, the prostitution of children. That is the kind of thing that in some of the families, a small percentage at the very end of this process, that's the kind of thing that ends up happening, where almost anything is possible at all, once there has been a total sort of collapse of social norms around parenting, right? Okay, the other dynamic, and the one I've already mentioned, is the loss of self-efficacy. And so self-efficacy, that's kind of like a jargony social worker term, but it just means the ability to do things on one's own behalf and the confidence in one's ability to take care of oneself within, you know, reasonable kind of parameters. And so I've already mentioned some of the factors that cause parents to lose that degree of self-efficacy. Poverty is one of those factors. Major depression is one of those factors. I'm going to come back to the depression thing in just a minute. Drug and alcohol is one of those factors. Violence is one of those factors. And so little by little, people are losing the ability to do things on their own behalf and on behalf of their kids. So one of the first effects in chronic neglect in neglectful families, the way that shows up is that parents cannot maintain a parenting structure. And so if you think about a parenting structure, I mean, that's just saying we have a routine within the family. I mean, we get our kids up in the morning and we get them cleaned up and fed and off to school. And when they come home, we have a way of supervising them and a way of feeding them in the evening and spending some time reading to them or having fun, bathing, you know, a structure of activities. One of the first things that happens in neglectful families is that that kind of parenting structure begins itself to collapse. Parents no longer have the energy to maintain it under the pressure of drug and alcohol, of depression, and other kind of mental health conditions. And that's the kind of capacity that has to be restored in neglecting families. It's that capacity. So everything having to do with drug and alcohol treatment, everything having to do with mental health treatment or with crisis intervention around domestic violence or whatever it is, the goal is always to restore the agency, the self-efficacy of people to do things on their own behalf. And that's how you know that treatment programs are succeeding. It's not that someone has completed a treatment program in and of itself, as praiseworthy as that is. It's not getting through a program. It's not getting a certificate that says that I did something. It's not even succeeding in doing something. It's not even just succeeding in becoming clean and sober. It's actually, as a result of that, being able to, you know, have a restored level of agency, of self-efficacy, where I can do things on my, so I can get my kids up, perfectly normal routine thing. I can get my kids up in the morning. I can feed them. If I need help, I ask for help. I can handle things in a reasonable way within limits, not meaning that I have control over every facet of my life. No one has that. I mean, even if you're super wealthy, you don't, right? But within reasonable parameters, depending again on your economic conditions and the resources that you have. So that's what has to be restored in the families. And part of that is also a restoration of a respect for those parenting standards. So if you think about, you know, what leads to chronic neglect, the erosion, the collapse of parenting standards, and the loss of self-efficacy, that's what has to be restored in the families. Both of those things, the ability to do things on one's own behalf and the respect for and the belief in the maintenance of those kind of parenting standards. And so one of those standards might be, for example, in a in a family where maybe a mother has had a drug alcohol issue for years and years. One parenting standard that most of us, you wouldn't have to even argue about it. If someone is dangerous to my kids, they can't be in my home. If someone has a sexually predatory history, they cannot be around my kids. If someone may blow up at any moment and become violent, they cannot be in this house. Okay, so the ability to maintain that kind of standard, that is a sign that someone has actually made therapeutic progress. It's not in and of itself getting clean and sober. It's not in and of itself just having less depressive symptoms. It's as a result of being able to do those things because one is mentally and emotionally better off than you were before. So let me stop, and before we'll take a little break here in just a minute here, and let me see if you have any comment or question here. Okay, so before we break, I do want to say one more thing around the depression issue, because this doesn't get the attention that it deserves within child welfare, in my view, and within the treatment community as well. I mean, lots more discussion around drug and alcohol issues for obvious reasons than around this, right? So the way to understand, and I've already mentioned that a lot of the chronic neglecting group has co-occurring disorders. They have combinations of drug and alcohol and depression or anxiety, PTSD as well. So think for a second about the differences between being depressed, and every one of us presumably has had this experience. It's like depression, like the common cold of mental health ailments. I mean, we all get it from time to time, and for the most part, and sometimes it can be severe for some period of time. We just get over it. We don't get any treatment. We don't use antidepressants. I mean, at some point we're down and we have low energy, and we don't, life seems glum and bleak. And then a few days later, a week or two later, a month later, we feel a lot better. So that's sort of the normal course of depression. But major depression, the more severe depression that usually does require some kind of treatment, has this other kind of dimension. And that dimension is a cognitive dimension. And it goes something like this. Whatever it is that I am depressed about, and that can be anything in the alphabet from A to Z, I don't really believe it's going to get any better. So whether that's my economic situation, whether that's my interpersonal relationship, whether that's my health, whether that's my character, my romantic potential, I mean, it can be anything and everything. But the underlying kind of idea here is that I've given up on the idea that it's going to get better. And so I don't really believe that what anyone comes to me, when they come to me with offers of help, I don't necessarily really believe that anything a helper person offers me is going to help me. And that might be based on a lot of experience. That is, people may have been in drug and alcohol treatment programs and bombed out of those programs or failed to complete them a number of times. That would be very, very common for the people we deal with in child welfare. There's some research that has shown that most people who go to mental health therapists or to mental health centers for depression issues, the majority of those people do not come back for the second visit. Sometimes it takes half a dozen efforts to begin depression treatment before anyone really follows through on even a course of depression treatment there. So this underlying cognitive thing is there's a very, very strong, a lot of times dysfunctional belief that has to be overcome in the initial stages for people even to seek help, to even receive help in the first place. Because the response of a lot of very depressed people initially has been that I don't necessarily believe you're really interested in me, but even if you are, you don't have anything that's going to help me. And so that's a very powerful belief. And so it is one of the amazing things around people and around mental health conditions in general is that there's a strong impulse to defend and to maintain our beliefs about the world, even if they're dysfunctional beliefs, even if they cause pain, even if they hurt us, even if they hurt other people. A lot of times the motivation is to hang on to the dysfunctional belief. And that's where the kind of initially, a lot of times the resistance is coming from. So I guess the concrete meaning of this, and then we'll talk about this a little bit more after break here in a minute, is that the first kind of challenge that both caseworkers and other helpers, therapists, people in the community have to overcome, challenge when they deal with the chronic neglect group, they have to overcome this resistance based on this idea that there's no way that I can be helped. I don't really believe that I can ever give up drug and alcohol, or I don't believe that I've been depressed for as long as I can remember, and I don't necessarily believe that an antidepressant or anything else is going to particularly help me there. So there's going to be an engagement issue initially, is what I'm saying. And so it turns out to matter a great deal what the engagement skills are of CPS caseworkers, people in the child welfare world, of therapists, of people in the mental health sector. What are their capacity to overcome that kind of initial resistance to help? Because it is going to be there a lot. And of course, what you're going to see as causes a lot of the time is that even when kids are in foster care and parents are potentially facing the complete and utter total loss of their kids forever, right? They may not initially get into treatment in a timely, quick way, in a way that we believe they ought to and that courts are ordering them to. There may really have to be a period there where they just quite seemingly can't quite get it together. And so it's that issue around engagement and getting people moving in terms of doing things on their own behalf. That's really half of succeeding at treatment. It isn't necessarily the characteristics of all of the treatment programs. A lot of times it's the motivation to actually actively seek help and to use whatever help is out there. And until people have that kind of motivation, a lot of times, nothing that people do for them in programs is going to be particularly helpful. So that's the kind of the initial challenge. Okay, so with that, it's 10:14. Let's take about a 10-minute break here. So let's come back at 10:25, right?